is not a courtesy visit. This is high-level strategic diplomacy occurring at precisely the moment Canada needs it. The visit will take place from January 13th to 17th. Carney will meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang. Topics will include the $118.7 billion annual trade, energy exports that could rebuild Canada's prosperity, agricultural markets desperately needed by prairie farmers, and international security cooperation at a time of shifting global balances. And what makes the timing of this visit so crucial is this. This visit was announced on January 7th, just 4 days after Donald Trump seized control of Venezuelan oil, 2 days before Trump threatened to acquire Greenland the hard way, and less than a week before Carney traveled to Davos to position Canada as a leading destination for global investment. Ladies and gentlemen, when a prime minister travels abroad, his schedule reveals his priorities. Carney is spending 5 days in China, 1 day in Qatar, and 3 days in Davos. This is no coincidence. It is a deliberate signal that Canada is moving away from its exclusive dependence on the United States to diversify and build relationships with countries that can offer alternatives when American policy becomes unpredictable. If you want analysis that connects diplomatic visits to strategic advantage, subscribe now. Because what happens in Beijing this week will shape Canadian trade, energy exports, and international positioning for years to come. Let's start with why this visit matters so much historically. The last Canadian Prime Minister to visit China was Justin Trudeau in December 2017. That's more than 8 years ago. And in the years since, Canada-China relations collapsed. In December 2018, Canadian authorities arrested Meng Wanzhou, a senior Huawei executive, at Vancouver Airport on a U.S. extradition request. China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in what became known as the Two Michaels crisis. Those men spent nearly 3 years in Chinese detention under harsh conditions. Canada-China relations froze. High-level visits stopped. Trade relationships stagnated. Meng was eventually released in September 2021, and the 2 Michaels came home. But relations remained icy through Trudeau's final years. When Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, he signaled immediately that he wanted to reset the relationship, not to become dependent on China, but to ensure Canada had options. The breakthrough came in October 2025 at the APEC summit in South Korea. Carney met with Xi Jinping for the first time. That meeting went well enough that Xi personally invited Carney to visit Beijing. Personal invitations from Xi are significant. They indicate China sees value in the relationship and wants to elevate it. So tomorrow's arrival isn't just a prime minister showing up in Beijing. It's the result of months of diplomatic preparation, relationship building, and strategic positioning to ensure Canada has economic and security alternatives when the United States becomes unreliable. So what will Carney and Xi actually discuss? The official agenda includes trade, energy, agriculture, and international security. But let's be specific about what that means in practice. First, tariffs. During the Biden administration, Canada aligned with U.S. policy by imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The logic was to protect North American auto manufacturing from subsidized Chinese competition, but now Trump is in office, and his approach to China is erratic and unpredictable. Canada maintaining tariffs that were designed to align with Biden's policy no longer makes strategic sense if Trump is pursuing different objectives. Carney will likely discuss reducing or eliminating those EV tariffs as part of a broader trade negotiation. China wants access to Canadian markets. Canada wants concessions on other fronts. That's the trade space. Second, canola. This is huge for prairie farmers. China imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian canola several years ago during the Meng Wanzhou crisis. Those tariffs have devastated farmers in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta who depend on Chinese markets. Canola exports to China were worth billions annually before the tariffs. Getting them removed would provide immediate economic relief to one of Canada's most important agricultural sectors. Third, energy. This is where things get really interesting. Last week, Bloomberg reported that Chinese refiners are actively seeking Canadian oil to replace Venezuelan supplies now controlled by the United States. Canada's Trans Mountain Pipeline, completed in 2024, can move 890,000 barrels per day to the Pacific coast for export to Asia. but there's more capacity coming. Canada is clearing regulatory hurdles for a potential second West Coast pipeline. If that gets built, Canadian oil exports to China could increase massively. And unlike Venezuelan oil, now subject to US political control and ongoing instability, Canadian oil offers reliability, regulatory predictability, and lower geopolitical risk. Carney said on January 6th in Paris that Canadian oil is competitive because it's low risk, clearly low risk, low cost, and low carbon. Thanks to carbon capture technology. That's not just marketing. That's a value proposition to Chinese buyers who need reliable energy supplies without the complications of dealing with American-controlled resources. Fourth, critical minerals. China dominates global supply chains for rare earth elements and critical minerals used in everything from batteries to semiconductors to defense systems. Canada has significant deposits of these minerals but needs investment, infrastructure, and markets to extract and process them. China has capital, technology, and demand. Canada has resources. There's an obvious partnership opportunity here. The question is whether Carney can negotiate terms that give Canada control over strategic resources while attracting the investment needed to develop them. Fifth, international security. This is delicate. Canada is still a NATO member and a US ally, but China is a major power with interests in the Arctic, influence over North Korea, and leverage in multilateral institutions. Carney will discuss how Canada and China can cooperate on issues where their interests align: climate, trade rules, Arctic research, without compromising Canada's core alliances. Now let's talk about why this visit is happening right now. Because timing and diplomacy reveals strategy. On January 3rd, Trump launched a military operation into Venezuela and announced the United States would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely. That disrupted global energy markets and created urgency for countries like China that depended on Venezuelan supply. Suddenly, Canada's oil, accessible through Trans Mountain and potentially a second pipeline, became strategically valuable in ways it wasn't a week earlier. On January 8th, Bloomberg confirmed Chinese refiners are actively seeking Canadian crude. That's not speculation. That's actual market demand emerging in real time. Carney, arriving in Beijing on January 13th, means he's negotiating when China needs what Canada offers. That's leverage. On January 9th, Trump threatened to take Greenland the hard way, escalating tensions with NATO allies and demonstrating that American foreign policy under Trump is aggressive, unpredictable, and willing to threaten military force against democratic partners. That makes countries around the world, including China, more interested in relationships with stable, predictable middle powers like Canada. And here's the broader context. Trump has made clear he views trade as transactional and relationships as leverage opportunities. He's weaponized tariffs, threatened annexation, joked about Canada becoming the 51st state, and generally demonstrated contempt for traditional alliances. Every country watching this is asking, what happens if we depend exclusively on the United States and Trump decides to target us next? Canada's answer is we're building alternatives. Not to replace the US relationship, 75% of Canadian exports still go to America, but to ensure we have options. China is one of those options. The European Union is another. Qatar, which Carney visits on January 18th, is a third. Davos, where Carney goes from January 19th to 21st, provides access to global investors who might otherwise focus only on American markets. This isn't anti-American policy. This is pro-Canadian resilience. And China understands that. Xi Jinping knows Canada isn't abandoning the United States, but he also knows Canada is looking for partners who can provide economic and political alternatives when American behavior becomes destabilizing. That's an opening China wants to exploit. Of course, deepening relationships with China carries risks, and Carney is well aware of them. First risk, human rights. China's record on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and domestic political repression is well documented and troubling. Canadians care about human rights. Any prime minister getting too cozy with Beijing risks domestic backlash from human rights advocates, opposition politicians, and voters who don't want Canada legitimizing authoritarian behavior. Carney has been careful on this. He's meeting with Xi to discuss trade and security, not to endorse China's political system, and he's been clear that Canada will raise human rights concerns directly in these meetings, even if those discussions remain private. Second risk, economic dependence. Canada spent decades becoming deeply integrated with the US economy. That created vulnerabilities Trump is now exploiting. Simply replacing American dependence with Chinese dependence would recreate the same problem with a different partner. Carney's strategy is diversification, not substitution. China becomes a larger trading partner, but so do the EU, UK, Qatar, Australia, and others. The goal is to ensure no single country, including China, has the leverage to coerce Canada economically. Third risk, security concerns. China is a strategic competitor to the United States. Canada shares intelligence with the US through Five Eyes. There are legitimate concerns about technology transfer, espionage, and critical infrastructure controlled by Chinese companies. Huawei, telecom networks, critical minerals. All of these raise security questions. Carney's approach is compartmentalization. Trade and investment in non-sensitive sectors can proceed, but critical infrastructure, defense technology, and intelligence-related areas remain protected. It's possible to buy canola from Canada without giving China access to Canadian defense networks. Fourth risk, Trump's reaction. If Trump sees Canada deepening ties with China, he might view it as disloyalty and retaliate with tariffs or other economic measures. That's a real possibility given Trump's transactional worldview, but here's Carney's calculation. Trump has already demonstrated he'll use tariffs regardless of Canadian behavior. He's already threatened annexation. He's already undermined the relationship. So the risk of angering Trump is less significant than the risk of remaining completely dependent on a partner who's proven unreliable. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig, one of the two Michaels detained by China, said recently that Canada should engage with China eyes wide open. That's exactly what Carney is doing. Not naive embrace of China, but pragmatic recognition that Canada needs multiple partners to maintain sovereignty and economic security. So what would make this visit successful? What should Canadians look for when Carney returns on January 17th? First, concrete commitments on canola tariffs. If China agrees to reduce or eliminate the 25% tariffs, that's immediate economic benefit for prairie farmers. That's money in pockets, jobs protected, and a signal that the relationship is improving in tangible ways. Second, energy export agreements. If China commits to long-term purchases of Canadian oil or invests in the pipeline infrastructure that diversifies Canada's energy markets and reduces dependence on U.S. refineries. It also strengthens the economic case for building that second West Coast pipeline. Third, critical minerals partnerships. If Canadian mining companies secure deals with Chinese processors or investors, that advances Canada's ability to develop strategic resources. The key is ensuring Canada maintains control over extraction and primary processing, even if Chinese capital or technology is involved. Fourth, regular dialogue mechanisms. If Carney and Xi establish frameworks for annual meetings, ministerial exchanges, and working-level cooperation that institutionalizes the relationship,